Hello and welcome to this teaching from King's Church Wirral. My name's Ben Watt and you join us today in the middle of our series on rest, spiritual intimacy and the elimination of hurry. So far we have looked at the problem that hurry has in our lives, in our culture, the pace of life that we exist in, and how that seems to stand in very stark contrast to what we see in the life of Jesus, who lived this incredibly unhurried existence. Productive but unhurried. Spent the last 2 weeks looking at silence and solitude, both as a means to find God and to find self, but also as something that was so clearly in the rhythm of Jesus' day-to-day life. Something that he calls his followers to live in too. And so we come to this week, where this week I'm going to be starting some teaching looking at a very ancient practice that serves to make sure that rest is central to our life. A practice given to us by God, modelled to us by God, commanded to us by God, and encouraged in our lives by God, and yet seems to have been left by a large part of even modern church to the wayside under the label of legalism. But it is, in my opinion, that it's one of the most important disciplines that a follower of Jesus can put into their life if they want to live the easy yoke that Jesus promised. I'm talking about Sabbath. And by Sabbath, I mean a 24-hour period set aside each week, as regular as possible, where we stop, rest, delight, and worship. We stop from work, from worry, from want, and from hurry, where we set aside no less than one day to just delight in God and in who he has made us to be and to worship. Now next week I want to look at a more practical approach to Sabbath, what it looks like to stop, rest, delight and worship in 21st century Britain and in the pace of the modern world. But this week I'm going to be exploring the nature of Sabbath throughout the Bible in an attempt to show that it is not a legalistic principle or practice reserved for those who don't understand grace. Neither is it like a state that we just exist in, although it does pervade into the rest of our lives, but that God has gifted us something that we can be all too guilty of rejecting or dismissing. So I'm going to begin with the first Sabbath that's found in Genesis chapter 2. So Genesis 1 ends with the sixth day being completed. And Genesis 2 starts with these words. Thus the heavens and the earth were completed in all their vast array. By the seventh day, God had finished all the work he had been doing. So on the seventh day, he rested from all his work. Then God blessed the seventh day and made it holy, because on it he rested from all the work of creating that he had done. Now this is a passage that many people have read many times, but when you just stop and dissect it, some serious questions can arise. This is the one that really jumps to my mind. God rested. God rested. Now, just consider your motivation for rest. Why and when do you rest? I know for me, I rest at the end of my day because I am tired. Or I rest at weekends because I am tired. Or I rest on holiday because I have burned out and I'm very tired. But there is a very, very common theme to my approach to rest. And that is I take rest as a necessity to be restored from fatigue. At my worst, I can even feel guilty about resting because it feels like unproductive time. Somehow, because I'm resting, it's because I'm succumbing to my weaknesses and my limitations that if I was perfect, I wouldn't have. And as such, if I was perfect, if I had no limitations, and I could keep going without getting tired, there would be no need to rest. God rested. God rested. He is limitless and perfect, but God rested. Now, when I first considered this, it caused me to really rethink a very deep-rooted lie that I feel I'd fallen for. And that is that God gives us rest because it is necessary to restore us. And you see, the thing is, God did not need restoring. He was not tired. Now, maybe, it got me thinking, maybe that the biblical worldview of the seventh day is not a day purely for restoration so that we can somehow be revived to go back to the hurry and back to the rat race and back to the pace. Like, why did God rest? I also don't believe that it's purely to serve as an example to us. It's not like God was saying, I know I've created limited beings, so I will do something to show them how they're going to need to do it. I don't think he only did it to show us how to do it, because at this point in the narrative, there really isn't that much us to show. I believe God needed to rest, but not because he was tired or limited. I think a clue to why God rested is found at the end of chapter 1. It says this: God saw all that he had made, and it was very good. I believe God rested in order to delight in all that he had achieved. Now consider this. God rested to delight in what he created. In fact, the Hebrew word Shabbat can be translated as rest, but it has tones of rejoice and delight. It's not just stopping. It's stopping with purpose to delight and rejoice. See, to rest, rejoice and delight, they weren't separable ideas like we separate them. They weren't separable. Now here's a question. When was the last time you got to the end of a busy week, sometimes even a frantic week, having got loads done and being really productive, and just took time to delight in what you've created? We are creating beings. We are made in the image of our creating creator. But I believe we've lost what it is to take time to delight in that. To delight in God, to delight in our lives, to delight in our family, to delight in our work. You see, when God rested, it was so that he could delight in what he had created. So the first thing that we need to take away from this is this. You might say, oh, I've got a really high capacity. You know what? Rest is not actually about your capacity. Or you might say, look, you're so busy you don't have time to take a whole day of rest. Or you might say that you love your job so much that you don't need to rest from it because it doesn't drain you. If those are things that are like jumping into your mind over whether or not Sabbath is worth doing, I would argue that, like me, you have misunderstood why God gives us this day. Now, it does serve to restore, but the first mention of this principle is not one of restoration, but one of stopping and delighting in what had been done. So we're going to leave that there. There's a lot we could say, but there's other things that we need to look at. We're going to fast forward to the Ten Commandments found in Exodus chapter 5. Now, to give some context to when the Ten Commandments were first given in Exodus 5, the people of Israel have just been freed from Egypt. They've been in Egypt for 400 years of slavery. They've got no culture, no law to govern them. They have been under other culture with other gods and other laws. So God takes them and he gives them this list of commandments. What can be very arguably described as a list of things required for this new society to function well and to flourish. You know, things like, if you want to flourish as a society, don't kill each other. It's good advice. If you want your families to flourish, don't sleep with each other's spouses. Don't steal from each other. Don't lie about each other. This is all fantastic advice that God commands his people so that this new society coming out of Egypt can function and flourish. Now, when he gives the commands, it's quite clear he starts with the most important commands. His first command is, don't have other gods that take my place. Have no other gods before me. He says, don't worship objects or representations of gods in the form of graven images. And he says, don't misuse my name. 3 commands to ensure that he stays in the right place, as that is actually the most important thing for the society of the people of God to flourish. Then he goes on to how they are to live in relation to one another. And he starts front and centre. The 4th command says this: remember the Sabbath day by keeping it holy. 6 days you shall labour and do all your work, but the 7th day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. On it you shall not do any work, neither you, nor your son or daughter, nor your male or female servant, nor your animals, nor any foreigner residing in your towns. For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth, the sea and all that is in them. But he rested on the 7th day. Remember, that word rested means delight, worship, find joy in. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy. So he says, straight after saying, keep me at the centre, he says, you want to know the key to flourishing? Rest. Rest as part of your weekly rhythm. Rest because I did it. Rest. Take a day. Rest. Not just you, but everyone. Rest. Not just people who know me, but everyone else in the land as well. Rest. And by rest, worship, delight, rejoice. This is a day that has been set aside for this. It has been made holy. It is a separate day. It is a different day to the rest of the week. Now, you might think that the most important command might be something like, don't kill each other. You know, God gives 4 words to that command. You shall not murder. It's quite simple. Now, in the NIV, there are 287 words that make up the 10 commandments. 99 of them are about Sabbath. That's 34% of the 10 commandments are ensuring that the people take a day of rest. It feels a little bit like God's kind of labouring the point a bit. Take the day of rest. It should make us sit up and take note. He gives a lot of time to making sure the people do this. Maybe, just maybe, it is more important than our current lifestyles imply it is. Now you see, the 10 commandments are repeated in Deuteronomy 5 and are nearly identical. Apart from the 4th commandment actually changes. The commandment about Sabbath changes. Firstly, it changes from remember the Sabbath to observe the Sabbath. Okay, I'm not going to talk a lot about that. It's an interesting shift in language. But in Deuteronomy 5, it is still the largest of the commandments, and it's still the only one where a reason is given. A reason is given for the commandment. But the reason changes in Deuteronomy 5. In Exodus, the reason given to the first generation leaving Egypt is that God rested. You rest because God rested. You rest and delight and worship and give time and enjoy because God did that. But in Deuteronomy, the reason given to the new generation is to remember that you were slaves in Egypt and that God bore you out with a mighty hand, therefore keep the Sabbath. Now I find this as a phenomenal challenge when I ask what it means to my own life. He's saying, remember what it was like to have to work 7 days of the week as a slave to the taskmaster Egyptians, never resting, never having time to delight, never stopping. Remember that and let that be your reason for keeping Sabbath. Now, I don't know about you, but I often feel like my life is closer to the never-stopping slavery of Egypt than to the solution that God has for that. We're not meant to remember Egypt and say, hey, those were pretty productive days. We wouldn't have got so much done if we'd taken a day off every week. What we're meant to say is, isn't it wonderful that God has given us a command to stop, rest, delight, and worship? Put another way, imagine you got a new job and your boss comes to you on day one and he says, look, there's a bit of an odd rule in this company. We work a 40-hour week. We've got 2 weekend days. Wow, that's perfectly normal, you're thinking. And he says, but the boss says this. He says, the company expects you to get all of your household jobs, the stuff we don't pay you to do, get all of that done on one of the 2 days that you're not in work. But the other day, do nothing but enjoy your life. Sleep in, eat well, rest on the other day. Spend time with your kids. What they say is, we are expecting of you 52 days every year where you don't work. It's just part of how we do things. That's what God has done for us. Work 6 days, rest 1 day. That's the rhythm that God shows in creation and the rhythm he has written into us. Now imagine going back to the old way with some new boss who expects you to work all week, both days at weekends, work harder if you want that promotion, work harder if you want to feel satisfied with your life. You see, that's more normal in our world, but it's not what God says to do. Now, good news is most of us don't have bosses like that. And actually, that's not true. We do have bosses like that. They're called ourselves. We're going to look at that more next week. But that was a very, very hard thing for me to overcome in practicing Sabbath. It wasn't the demands that were being put on me, it was the demands that I put on myself that this really did release me from as I learned to practice this. So we've seen that rest is not a byproduct of limitation or imperfection or fatigue, but a time to delight in all that we create and a time to delight in God. It is a time to stop and to worship, and we see that it is very important to God. It actually seems to our Western 21st century eyes maybe a little oddly high on his priority list, that it's the first command he gives for flourishing, and it stands in such contrast to the way of our world. But then, when did the way of Jesus not do that? When did the way of Jesus not stand in contrast to the way our world works? Steph and myself first heard about the idea of practicing Sabbath about 3 years ago when John Marcoma taught at New Wine. We really liked the idea. We did nothing about it. We agreed, but we didn't own it. We agreed with the teaching, but we didn't own the teaching. The following year, Darren Ruanzoin spoke, and he also talked about taking Sabbath. And he reminded us that we really liked this idea and we thought we'd try doing it. There was a very interesting moment during that week. I spoke to Darren about getting some of the notes that he was using, and he asked me to email him. So I emailed him, and he had an automated out-of-office reply where it said, I'm not in the office now because I believe in the rhythm of work and rest. I'm not checking my emails today. You know what? I just thought that was a brilliant way to do email. I'm not going to a notice on my phone pinging me to tell me I've got work to do. This is my day where I'm not working. I'm delighting in God. This is more practical stuff. I should save that for next week. So having heard Darren speak reminded us to start doing it. So we did, 1 day a week. Starting at 7 o'clock on Friday night with a wonderful meal, going through to 7 o'clock on the Saturday night. We've been going for 18 months now. It has been the hardest discipline of my life. Compared to this, fasting is easy. Being hungry for a little bit, not actually that hard. For me. Sabbath, my word, difficult, really hard. It seems crazy. What? It's hard to take a day off. Actually, amazingly it is. I was so ingrained into the 7-day working week that stopping for a day was so hard. But I also think that the harder a discipline is to live, chances are it's the most needed. Because it's probably an indication as to how far from where you should be you actually are. Like, I was a long way from being able to rest in God. That's why it was so hard for me to try to do this. Now, 18 months later, we're much better at it, and we're still learning. Now, I want to jump ahead a bit now to what Jesus has to say on Sabbath. Because so far it's all Old Testament, and sometimes it can be a bit easy to dismiss this as law. It's Old Testament. It's been fulfilled in Jesus. Now, the first thing I'd say on that is, you wouldn't apply that to any of the other 10 Commandments. You don't worry, we can steal now because we're not under law. Thieving is more of a state of mind than it is an action. And we say that about Sabbath. Sabbath's more of a way we live than it is a day. It's actually both, but it is a day. Or, you know what, I do have lots of graven images. Big fan of the graven images, because not worshipping graven images, that's more of a way we live. It's a heart condition than it is about actually not actually worshipping the graven image. We wouldn't do that. We wouldn't say of the other commandments, oh, it's an existence I live in. It may be. It may be, because that's what they're meant to do. They're meant to go through all of your existence. But they are also actions that we take. Anyway, let's have a look at what Jesus says about Sabbath. So in Mark 2, there's this very interesting exchange between Jesus and the Pharisees, and it says this. One Sabbath, Jesus was going through the grain fields, and his disciples walked along. They began to pick some heads of grain. The Pharisees said to him, "Look, why are they doing what is unlawful on the Sabbath?" Now, just to let you know, what was going on here is that in order to make sure Sabbath was observed, a lot of secondary laws had been built around it. Now, one of these was that you weren't allowed to pick grain on the Sabbath. Because if you could pick grain on the Sabbath, well, maybe a farmer might do a bit of a sneaky harvest. Suddenly they're working when they should be resting because that's their job. There were other things like you were allowed to go for a walk on a Sabbath, but not more than 1/4 of a mile, because more than 1/4 of a mile is a journey. So that's not rest. That's not a day off. That's not a stopping. So there were all these laws that had been built up that were not actually in the commandments, not actually in the law or in the Torah, but had been built up as a safeguard around it to make sure you didn't even get close to violating the law. You can't get close to violating law about harvesting if you're not even allowed to pick a head of grain, keeping us a long way from violating the law. So the disciples were enjoying a walk, they get their snack on, and they pick some grain. They're not violating Sabbath law, but they are violating these additional laws that have been put in place. Now Jesus gives a example from the Old Testament as to why what they're doing is not actually a problem. They're not doing anything wrong. But then he says these words: "The Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath." Now what he's saying there is that what Jesus is doing is he's re-establishing the priority of Sabbath to the Pharisees. What order priority goes in? Man is not made for the Sabbath. We are not made for it. Okay? Sabbath is not higher than us. That's what they needed to hear. That's what they needed to hear. They had so ring-fenced Sabbath. That Sabbath was such a legalistic thing that it was no longer really the day of rest it was meant to be. Man was not made for it. But I wonder whether we actually need to hear the first part of Jesus' rebuke. Sabbath was made for man. It's God's gift to us. Sabbath has been given to us by God. A gift of a day to stop, rest, worship and delight. God is not trying to take something from you with Sabbath. He's not trying to steal one of your days. It's actually about giving you something. And it's something that we sorely need. Sorely need. Now next week, like I said, I'm going to be looking at what it is to live Sabbath, what it looks like. Things that probably are helpful and not helpful to do. Things that put the discipline in well. But I just want to end this week with just some experienced truth from my year and a half living Sabbath. Steph and myself, we're both actually quite driven people. We love to achieve. When we first started practicing Sabbath, we actually didn't know how we were going to have time to do everything that we wanted to do. We filled our days. We were busy people. But we've learned a few things. The first thing is this, that in order to do this, we actually had to rebuild our lives around it, not fit it into our lives. It had to become the immovable point. Secondly, based on that, what we therefore learned was the rest of the week becomes more disciplined when we have Sabbath. I don't have the option, for want of a better way, to not get my work done or to leave it hanging over. I've got to get it done because that's how I have my day of rest. And the day of rest is immovable. Because we're more disciplined, we tend to get more achieved in the rest of our time. The law, to remind, says 6 days you will work and 1 day you will rest. It says to work for 6 days and to rest for 1. Thirdly, after 18 months, it is consistently the best day of our week. We love it. I would go as far as to say that it is the single most influential change to benefit my walk with God that I have ever made. And we will never stop practicing it. Thank you for listening.